a dog threw itself between a toddler and a stranger in broad daylight. And what security cameras captured in the moments that followed would expose a predator that had been hunting in this quiet, suburban neighborhood for years. But this isn't just a story about a dog saving a child. This is the story of how one act of courage unraveled a terrifying conspiracy and transformed an entire community forever. On a golden Saturday afternoon, Riverside Park was alive with the kind of beauty that makes you believe the world is fundamentally good. The sun hung high and warm in a cloudless sky, casting everything in that perfect, honeyed light that only happens in late spring. Children's laughter echoed across the open fields, pure, uninhibited, the sound of pure joy that seemed to wash away every worry and concern in the world. Among them was Emily. Just 3 years old, with golden curls that bounced with every step she took, she moved through the park like she owned it. Her pink sundress, the one with the white lace trim that her grandmother had bought her, twirled as she danced, her small hands reaching toward the sky as if she could grab the clouds themselves and pull them down to play with her. Her feet barely touched the ground as she skipped from one patch of grass to another, her laughter ringing out like tiny bells. And right beside her, never more than a few feet away, was Max. Max was a golden retriever, the kind of dog that seemed to have been born knowing exactly how to love. His coat shimmered in the sunlight like spun gold, and his eyes held an intelligence and gentleness that made everyone who met him instantly trust him. He was 4 years old, in his prime, with a muscular build that spoke to his strength. Yet his demeanor was nothing but pure kindness. But more than that, Max had a bond with Emily that was almost supernatural in its depth and intensity. He watched her every move with the devotion of a guardian angel. When she laughed, his tail wagged with such enthusiasm that his entire back end wiggled. When she stumbled on uneven ground, he was there in an instant, his solid body providing support and stability. When she picked flowers from the grass, he sat patiently beside her, his presence a constant reassurance that she was safe, that she was loved, that nothing in the world could hurt her while he was near. Emily had grown up with Max from the time she was born. In her earliest memories, Max was there, a warm, golden presence that meant comfort and safety. She would fall asleep with her small hand tangled in his fur. She would wake up to his gentle nose nudging her awake. Max wasn't just a pet. He was her first friend, her constant companion, her protector in a way that only a dog could be. Sarah, Emily's mother, stood nearby with her husband Tom, watching their daughter play. Sarah's face was relaxed, peaceful, and genuinely happy in a way that she rarely allowed herself to be during the busy weekdays. She'd spent the morning worrying about work deadlines, unpaid bills, and the endless to-do list that seemed to grow longer every single day. But here, in this moment, all of that melted away like snow in spring sunshine. Her daughter was safe. Her daughter was happy. The dog was watching her. The sun was warm on her skin. What could possibly go wrong? Tom had his arm around Sarah's waist, and they stood together in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes from years of being together. Occasionally, Sarah would point out something Emily was doing. "Look, she's making a flower crown." And they would smile at each other, grateful for this moment of peace in their otherwise chaotic lives. The park itself was a picture-perfect scene. The grass was a vibrant green, freshly mowed just days before. The trees provided dappled shade in some areas, while open fields stretched out in others, perfect for running and playing. A small playground sat in the distance, with children climbing on equipment and sliding down slides. Families spread across picnic blankets, sharing sandwiches and laughter. An elderly couple walked hand in hand along the path. A group of teenagers tossed a frisbee back and forth, their movements easy and carefree. This was the kind of afternoon that makes you forget about the darkness in the world. This was the kind of day that parents dream about, the kind of memory you hope your children will carry with them forever. The kind of day where danger felt like a distant, impossible concept that happened to other people in other places. Not here, not now, not to families like theirs. But danger was closer than anyone realized. At the far edge of the park, near the parking lot where the manicured grass gave way to asphalt, a man stood perfectly still. His name was Jake, and he didn't belong here. He was new to the neighborhood, moved in just 3 weeks ago to a small rental house on Maple Street, the one with the peeling paint that nobody wanted. He kept to himself mostly, nodded politely at neighbors when he encountered them at the grocery store, never caused a scene, never drew attention to himself. To anyone who noticed him at all, he was just another face in the crowd. Unremarkable, forgettable, the kind of person you'd see and immediately forget. But his eyes told a different story. Jake's gaze was locked on Emily with an intensity that would have chilled anyone who noticed it. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't watching casually like the other parents, enjoying the simple pleasure of seeing their children play. He was studying her, analyzing her. His jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles in his cheeks were visibly tense. His hands were shoved deep in his jacket pockets, his fingers curling and uncurling rhythmically. His breathing was shallow and controlled. The breathing of someone who was waiting for something, someone who was counting down to a moment he'd been anticipating for weeks. He'd been coming to this park for 3 weeks, 3 weeks of watching. 3 weeks of learning Emily's routine, her patterns, the times when Sarah's attention wandered, the moments when she was most vulnerable. 3 weeks of studying the layout of the park, identifying the blind spots where the security cameras didn't reach, planning the exact route he would take. 3 weeks of preparation for this moment. Max felt it first. The dog's ears perked up suddenly, his entire body going rigid as if someone had flipped a switch inside him. His tail, which had been wagging gently as he watched Emily play, stopped mid-wag. His nose twitched, catching a scent that made his instincts scream with alarm. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. Something dangerous had entered his territory, threatened his pack. Max's protective nature, bred into his very DNA over generations of loyal companions, generations of dogs who had stood between their families and danger, activated like an ancient alarm system. He shifted his position smoothly, moving slightly closer to Emily, his eyes never leaving the stranger at the edge of the park. His fur bristled ever so slightly along his spine, a physical manifestation of his heightened awareness. Emily, oblivious to the shift in energy, to the subtle change in the atmosphere around her, continued playing, picking dandelions from the grass and blowing the seeds into the wind, watching them dance and swirl through the air with pure delight. Jake took a step forward, then another. Each step was measured, calculated, designed not to startle anyone. He was moving slowly, deliberately, like a predator stalking prey. His face had arranged itself into what he probably thought was a friendly expression. A slight smile that didn't reach his eyes, softened features that were meant to appear harmless. But there was something underneath it, something that didn't quite fit, something that was fundamentally wrong, something predatory that no amount of practiced smiling could hide. Max's body tensed further. A low, almost inaudible growl rumbled in his chest, a warning that only those closest would hear. It was a sound that had never come from Max before. A sound that spoke to something primal and protective deep within his being. But Sarah and Tom were too far away, caught up in conversation with another couple about their upcoming vacation plans. They didn't see Jake approaching. They didn't see the way he was moving with calculated precision toward their daughter, closing the distance inch by inch. They didn't see the way his eyes tracked Emily's every movement. They didn't see what Max saw. Emily looked up from her flowers just as Jake knelt down to her level, his movements smooth and practiced. She tilted her head, curious about this stranger who had appeared in her world. Her innocent eyes studied his face, trying to understand who this person was and what he wanted from her. Max immediately positioned himself between them, his body now fully alert, his muscles coiled like springs ready to release. His stance had shifted from protective to defensive, his entire being focused on this one threat. But in that moment, with the sun still shining brightly overhead and the park still filled with the sounds of laughter and joy, nobody else noticed. Nobody else saw the danger that had just materialized in broad daylight. Nobody else understood that the next few seconds would determine the course of Emily's entire life, that the decisions made in the next heartbeat would echo through the years to come. Max's eyes never left Jake's face. He was reading every micro-expression, every subtle shift in body language, trying to understand the full extent of the threat before him. Jake's eyes never left Emily. His focus was absolute, his attention completely consumed by the small child in front of him. And Emily, innocent and trusting, simply waited to see what this stranger wanted, her small hand still clutching the dandelions she'd picked. But Emily's mother had no idea that, in just moments, her daughter would be in the crosshairs of a predator. And only one living creature stood between Emily and a nightmare that would have haunted her forever. Jake's smile widened as he knelt down, his knees bending to match Emily's eye level. Up close, he could see the delicate features of her face, the light dusting of freckles across her nose, the way her eyes sparkled with innocent curiosity, the soft wisps of golden hair that had escaped from her ponytail and framed her cherubic face. To him, she was perfect. She was exactly what he'd been looking for. "Hi there, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with a false warmth that sounded genuine to anyone who didn't know better. His tone was practiced, refined through years of perfecting the art of deception. "That's a beautiful flower crown you're making. Can I help you?" Emily tilted her head, considering this stranger. She was too young to understand the concept of danger, too innocent to recognize the predatory nature of his interest. In her 3 years of life, everyone had been kind to her. Everyone had smiled at her. Everyone had wanted to help her. Why would this person be any different? But Max knew. The golden retriever's growl deepened, becoming more pronounced, more insistent. His lips curled back slightly, revealing his teeth, not in aggression, but in warning. His entire body had positioned itself between Jake and Emily, a living barrier that couldn't be ignored. Max's muscles trembled with tension, with barely contained protective instinct. Every fiber of his being was screaming at him to act, to remove this threat, to protect his pack at any cost. "Max, be nice," Emily said sweetly, reaching down to pat the dog's head. She didn't understand his behavior. To her, Max was just being silly, just being protective in the way he always was. She had no comprehension of the danger that he was sensing. Jake's eyes flickered to Max for just a moment, and something dark crossed his face. The dog was a problem. He hadn't accounted for how protective Max would be, how vigilant. He'd observed Emily at the park before, but he'd never seen her so close to the dog, never seen how intensely Max watched her. This changed things. This complicated his plan. But Jake was patient. He was experienced. He'd dealt with obstacles before. "What's your dog's name?" Jake asked, keeping his voice light and friendly, though his jaw had tightened imperceptibly. He was already recalculating, already adjusting his strategy. Perhaps he could distract the dog somehow. Perhaps he could lure Emily away from the protection of her canine guardian. Perhaps he could... Max took a step forward, closing the gap between himself and Jake. His growl had transformed into something more primal, more dangerous. This wasn't the sound of a friendly family pet anymore. This was the sound of a protector who had identified a threat and was prepared to eliminate it. His ears were pinned back against his head, his eyes locked onto Jake's with an intensity that was almost supernatural. For the first time, Jake felt a flutter of genuine concern. He'd underestimated the dog. He'd thought that Max would be manageable, that he could work around him. But looking into those intelligent, protective eyes, he realized he'd made a critical error in his planning. Sarah's attention suddenly snapped to her daughter. Something in her mother's instinct, that ancient, primal awareness that something was wrong, had finally activated. She saw the stranger kneeling beside Emily. She saw Max's aggressive posture. She saw the way her daughter was looking at this man with curious innocence. "Emily," Sarah called out, her voice sharp with sudden alarm. She started walking quickly toward her daughter, her protective instincts overriding everything else. Tom, sensing the shift in his wife's demeanor, immediately followed her. Jake's face went through a rapid series of expressions: surprise, frustration, calculation. His window of opportunity was closing. He could feel it slipping away with each passing second. He stood up quickly, his friendly mask slipping for just a moment, revealing the darkness underneath. But then he caught himself, rearranging his features back into a pleasant expression. "Just admiring your beautiful daughter," he said to Sarah as she approached, his voice smooth and disarming. "She's got quite the protective dog there." But Max wasn't finished. As Jake stood up and prepared to back away, the dog made his move. With a sudden burst of speed that belied his size, Max lunged forward, his body interposing itself completely between Jake and Emily. His teeth snapped at the air just inches from Jake's leg, a clear warning that any further approach would result in serious consequences. The sound that came from Max's throat was unlike anything Emily had ever heard from her beloved pet. It was primal, ancient, filled with the kind of protective fury that transcended the boundaries between human and animal. It was the sound of a guardian who would not be denied, who would not back down, who would die before allowing harm to come to those he loved. Other people in the park had started to notice now. A few parents were watching with concern. An elderly man had stood up from his picnic blanket, his hand on his phone. The atmosphere of the peaceful afternoon had shifted dramatically, replaced by a tension that was almost palpable. Jake took several steps backward, his hands raised in a gesture of mock innocence. "Whoa, easy there, buddy. I was just being friendly," he said, though his eyes were cold, calculating, filled with barely concealed rage at having his plan thwarted. Sarah had reached Emily now, scooping her daughter up into her arms and pulling her close to her chest. Tom stood beside them, his protective instinct activated, his body language suddenly aggressive. Max continued to advance on Jake, step by step, forcing him backward across the grass toward the parking lot. "I think you should leave," Tom said, his voice low and dangerous. There was something in his tone that suggested he would be more than happy to back up Max's message with physical force if necessary. Jake continued backing away, his fake smile never wavering, though his eyes burned with something dark and dangerous. "No problem. Just a friendly conversation. Have a nice day." He called out, his voice carrying that false cheerfulness that made the entire interaction feel deeply wrong. As Jake reached the parking lot, he climbed into his car, a nondescript sedan that blended in with 1,000 others on the road. He started the engine and drove away slowly, his eyes visible in the rearview mirror, still fixed on Emily as she clung to her mother. But he was smiling, and that smile promised that this wasn't over, that this was just the beginning, that he would be back, and next time he would be better prepared. Next time he would account for the dog. Next time he would succeed. Max watched the car disappear down the street, his body still rigid, his protective instincts still on high alert. He turned back to Emily, pressing his nose gently against her leg, reassuring her that she was safe, that he was still here, that he would always protect her. Sarah held her daughter tighter, a chill running down her spine despite the warm afternoon sun. She didn't know what had just happened, but she knew it was something terrible. She knew that if it hadn't been for Max, if it hadn't been for her dog's incredible instincts and protective nature, something unspeakable might have occurred. "Thank you," she whispered to Max, running her hand through his golden fur. "Thank you for saving her." Max's tail wagged softly, but his eyes remained fixed on the direction where Jake's car had disappeared. His protective vigilance hadn't diminished. His awareness remained sharp. Because Max understood something that Sarah was only beginning to realize. The danger wasn't over. It was only paused, and it would return. What Emily's parents didn't know was that Jake's car had circled back around, parking a few blocks away. And from that vantage point, hidden from view, he was watching them, studying them, planning, because predators like Jake didn't give up. They adapted, they learned, and they came back stronger, more determined, more dangerous than before. The drive home from Riverside Park felt different to Sarah. The sun that had seemed so warm and inviting just minutes ago now felt oppressive, casting long shadows across the road that seemed to hide sinister possibilities. Emily sat in her car seat behind her, happily humming a tune she'd learned at daycare, completely oblivious to the fear that had gripped her mother's heart. Max sat beside Emily, his head turned toward the window, his ears alert to every sound, his protective instincts still activated from the encounter at the park. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles turning white from the pressure. Her mind was racing, replaying the encounter over and over again. Who was that man? What had he wanted? If Max hadn't been there, if her dog hadn't sensed the danger and reacted so aggressively, what would have happened to her daughter? The thought made her feel physically ill. Tom sat in the passenger seat, his jaw clenched, his own mind working through the implications of what they'd witnessed. He'd seen the predatory look in Jake's eyes in those final moments before he'd backed away. He'd recognized it for what it was, the look of someone who saw children not as innocent human beings, but as objects to be possessed, to be used, to be destroyed. "We should call the police," Tom said quietly, breaking the heavy silence that had filled the car. "And tell them what?" Sarah replied, her voice shaking slightly. "That a man talked to our daughter? That our dog growled at him? They'll think we're paranoid. They'll think we're overreacting." "He was trying to take her," Tom said, his voice firm with conviction. "I know what I saw in his eyes. He was planning something." Sarah nodded slowly. She knew Tom was right. She'd felt it too, that primal, maternal instinct that screams when danger is near. But the rational part of her brain was telling her that they had no concrete evidence, nothing that would convince a police officer that a crime had been committed or was about to be committed. Still, When they arrived home, Sarah immediately called the non-emergency police line. She described the man, his appearance, his behavior at the park. The officer who took her statement was polite but skeptical. Without a specific threat or criminal act, there wasn't much they could do. They would increase patrols in the area, the officer said. They would keep an eye out for suspicious activity. But beyond that, their hands were tied. After the call ended, Sarah felt a mixture of frustration and fear. The police couldn't protect them. The system couldn't protect them. All they had was Max. And while she trusted the dog with her life, with Emily's life, she knew that one dog couldn't be everywhere, couldn't be awake 24 hours a day. That night, as Emily slept peacefully in her bed, her small body curled up under her pink blanket with her favorite stuffed animal tucked under her arm, Sarah sat on the edge of the mattress and watched her daughter sleep. She studied every feature of Emily's face, the way her chest rose and fell with each breath, the slight smile that played at her lips, the absolute innocence and vulnerability that radiated from her small form. Max lay on the floor beside Emily's bed, his eyes open, his vigilance undiminished. The dog hadn't relaxed since the incident at the park. His protective instincts had been activated, and they remained in high alert. He watched Emily sleep, and he watched the doorway, and he watched the windows, his senses attuned to any potential threat. Sarah reached down and ran her hand through Max's fur. "You know something, don't you?" she whispered to the dog. "You know something about that man that I don't understand." Max's tail thumped softly against the floor, but his eyes never left the doorway. In the days that followed, Sarah's life took on a different quality. She became hypervigilant, constantly aware of her surroundings, constantly scanning faces in crowds, constantly checking to make sure Emily was safe. She started driving different routes to daycare, varying her schedule, making it harder for anyone to predict where she and Emily would be at any given time. She also started researching. Late at night, after Emily and Tom had gone to bed, Sarah would sit at her computer and search for information about child predators, about how they operate, about the warning signs that a child might be targeted. She read articles about abduction cases, about how predators scout their victims, about the importance of vigilance and awareness. The more she read, the more terrified she became. Because she realized that what had happened at the park wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern. Predators like Jake didn't just appear out of nowhere and attempt to take a child on impulse. They planned. They studied. They looked for vulnerabilities in the family's routine. And Jake had been coming to the park for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of watching. 3 weeks of learning Emily's patterns. Sarah's hands shook as she closed her laptop and made her way to Emily's room. Her daughter was sleeping peacefully, and Max was alert as always, his protective presence a constant reassurance. "I won't let anything happen to you," Sarah whispered to her sleeping daughter. "I promise. I won't let anything happen to you." But even as she made that promise, she knew that she couldn't do it alone. She needed help. She needed to understand the threat better. She needed to know what Jake wanted, why he'd chosen Emily, what his next move might be. The next morning, Sarah made a decision. She called a private investigator, a woman named Detective Maria Rodriguez, who had left the police force to start her own agency. Maria had a reputation for being thorough, for being able to find information that others couldn't, for being willing to do whatever it took to protect children from predators. When Sarah told her story, Maria's expression remained calm and professional, but her eyes hardened with recognition. She'd seen this pattern before. She knew exactly what it meant. You did the right thing by calling the police, Maria said, her voice steady and reassuring. And you did the right thing by calling me. Because what you're describing isn't just concerning. It's a textbook predatory pattern. This man has done this before, and he will do it again unless someone stops him. What do I do? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. First, you protect your daughter, Maria said. You vary your routines. You never leave her alone. You teach her about body safety and appropriate and inappropriate touches. You trust your instincts, and you trust that dog of yours. His instincts are probably better than any security system you could install. And then? Tom asked, his arm around Sarah's shoulders. Then we find him, Maria said, her eyes cold and determined. And we make sure he never comes near your daughter again. As Maria left their house, having gathered information and taken notes, Sarah felt a shift in her emotional state. The fear was still there, but it had been joined by something else, a fierce, protective anger, a determination to do whatever it took to keep her daughter safe. That night, as she tucked Emily into bed, Sarah made a silent vow. She would find out who Jake was. She would understand what he wanted. And she would make absolutely certain that he could never hurt her daughter or any other child. Max, sensing the shift in Sarah's emotional energy, pressed his nose against her leg in a gesture of support. The dog understood, on some level that transcended human language, that his human was preparing for battle. And Max was ready to fight beside her, to stand between Emily and any threat, to use every ounce of his strength and intelligence to protect the child he loved. But what neither Sarah nor Max knew was that Jake was also preparing. He was studying them more carefully now, learning from his mistakes, understanding that the dog was the key variable he hadn't accounted for. And he was developing a plan that would account for Max, that would neutralize the dog's protective abilities, that would finally allow him to take Emily and disappear into the darkness. The game had entered a new phase, and the stakes had never been higher. Detective Maria Rodriguez was a woman who had dedicated her life to protecting those who could not protect themselves. After spending 20 years in law enforcement, she had grown increasingly frustrated with the limitations imposed by the bureaucracy and restrictive protocols of the police system. She had seen too many cases fall through the cracks, too many predators slip away on technicalities, and too many families left without justice or closure. It was this frustration that propelled her to leave the force and establish her own private investigation agency. A choice that allowed her to pursue cases that others wouldn't touch. Cases that required a level of dedication and moral flexibility that the official system often failed to provide. When Sarah had called her, Maria recognized the fear in her voice immediately. It was the kind of fear that no parent should ever have to experience. The fear of a mother who understood, on some primal level, that her child was in danger. Maria had learned to trust that instinct. It was rarely wrong. The weight of a parent's worry was something she had encountered many times over the years, and it ignited a fierce determination within her to help Sarah protect her daughter. The first step in Maria's investigation was surveillance. She parked her nondescript sedan 3 houses down from Jake's rental property, ensuring she had a clear view of his driveway. Armed with binoculars and a notebook, she settled in for what would become days of careful observation. Each day blended into the next as she watched Jake come and go at various times, his demeanor a mix of nonchalance and calculated caution. He left his house in the morning, driving his car with the careful precision of someone who was trying very hard not to draw attention to himself. Maria noted his routes, the places he visited, and the people he interacted with. always vigilant, always aware. As she continued her surveillance, Maria followed Jake to a job site where he worked as a general contractor. This position gave him ample access to multiple neighborhoods and countless opportunities to scout potential victims. Over the course of a week, she gathered information, meticulously documenting his comings and goings. Each note she scribbled in her notebook felt like a piece of a puzzle falling into place. She was building a picture of his life, one that painted a troubling portrait of a man who had spent years honing his predatory instincts. Maria's investigative network extended far beyond mere observation. She reached out to contacts from her time on the force, police officers, social workers, other private investigators, seeking any information on Jake's background. What she discovered sent a chill down her spine. Jake's real name was Jacob Mitchell, and while he had no official criminal record, he had a history that was deeply concerning. A social worker in his previous state had flagged him as a person of interest in connection with a missing child case from 8 years ago. The case had gone cold, and without concrete evidence, no charges had ever been filed. But the pattern was there. A child had disappeared from a park where Jake had been seen multiple times. And a year later, another child had gone missing from a neighborhood where he had been doing construction work. Again, there had been no evidence, no charges. But the correlation was undeniable. Maria's investigation also revealed that Jake had recently moved to this town following a similar incident. A child had nearly been abducted from a shopping mall, and witnesses had described a man matching Jake's appearance leaving the area shortly after the incident. He had disappeared without a trace, just as many predators do when they sense the heat of an investigation closing in on them. When Maria presented this information to Sarah and Tom, the weight of the revelations was palpable in the air. Sarah felt her worst fears confirmed. This wasn't a random predator who had fixated on Emily. This was a serial predator, a man who had spent years perfecting his craft, who had likely succeeded multiple times before, who saw children as prey. The realization that Emily was merely one of many potential victims made Sarah's heart ache with a mixture of fear and anger. "We need to go to the police with this," Tom said immediately, his protective instincts overriding his earlier skepticism about law enforcement's ability to help. "We could," Maria replied carefully, her tone measured. "But without concrete evidence of a crime, without a confession, without physical evidence linking him to any of the missing children, the police will have a difficult time building a case. If we move too quickly, if we alert Jake that we're investigating him, he'll disappear. He'll leave town, and he might start hunting in another state, another city, another neighborhood where no one knows his pattern." "So what do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her heart. "We gather evidence," Maria replied, her determination unwavering. "We document his behavior. We build a case that is so airtight, so undeniable, that when we finally go to the police, they'll have no choice but to act. And we protect Emily in the meantime." Over the next 2 weeks, Maria worked tirelessly, her commitment to the case consuming her every waking hour. She installed security cameras around Sarah and Tom's house, hidden cameras that could capture anyone approaching their property without their knowledge. She obtained Jake's work schedule and cross-referenced it with the locations of missing children cases from the past 8 years. The pattern was undeniable. Wherever Jake had worked, children had gone missing or nearly been abducted. It was a chilling realization that deepened Maria's resolve to bring him to justice. She also began to dig deeper into Jake's personal life. She learned that he had a storage unit on the outskirts of town, rented under a false name. With each piece of information, Maria felt a sense of urgency. She obtained records showing that he made regular trips to that storage unit, always after dark, always when he thought no one was watching. The storage unit was significant. It was the kind of place where a predator might keep supplies, tools, and even evidence, all the things necessary to carry out his crimes. Accessing the storage unit would require either a warrant or breaking the law. Maria was willing to do the latter, but she wanted to ensure she had enough evidence first to justify the risk. The stakes were too high to act without a solid foundation. So she continued her surveillance, continued gathering information, and continued building the case piece by piece, each day bringing her closer to the truth. Meanwhile, Sarah's life transformed into a careful dance of protection and vigilance. She had quit her job to stay home with Emily, unable to bear the thought of her daughter being in daycare where she couldn't watch her every moment. Each day, she varied their routine, driving different routes to daycare, always staying alert, always on guard. She installed additional locks on the doors and windows of their home, reinforcing their security. She taught Emily about body safety, appropriate and inappropriate touches, and what to do if a stranger approached her. At such a young age, Emily was surprisingly receptive, absorbing her mother's lessons with the innocence of childhood, but also a growing understanding of the world around her. And then there was Max. The dog had grown even more protective in the days following the park incident. Max seemed to understand, on some instinctual level, that Emily was in danger. He followed her from room to room, his golden fur a constant presence at her side. He slept outside her bedroom door, ever watchful, his ears perked for any sound that might signal trouble. The bond between Emily and Max grew stronger, a testament to the unbreakable connection between a child and her protector. One afternoon, as Sarah was taking Emily for a supervised walk around the neighborhood, always with Max, always varying the route, always staying alert, she noticed a car parked across the street. It was Jake's car. He was inside, watching them. His face was visible through the windshield, and he was smiling that same cold, predatory smile that Sarah had seen at the park. The sight sent a shiver down her spine. Sarah's heart raced as a wave of panic washed over her. She immediately turned around, hurrying back to the house, pulling Emily along with her. Max's hackles were raised, the dog sensing the threat that was so close, so tangible. He growled softly, a low rumble that vibrated through his body, ready to protect his girl at any cost. That night, Sarah called Maria in a panic. "He's watching us," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "He's parked outside our house. He's watching us." "I know," Maria said, her voice calm and steady. "I've been documenting it. He's been increasing his surveillance over the past week. He's escalating. This means he's planning something. We need to call the police," Sarah insisted, her fear morphing into urgency. "We need to have him arrested. We need to. If we call the police now, without concrete evidence of a crime, he will claim he was just driving through the neighborhood," Maria interrupted. "He'll say he was looking for a work address. He'll deny everything, and without solid evidence, there's nothing they can do. But I'm close. I'm very close to having what we need." "How close?" Tom asked, his arm around Sarah's shoulders, providing her with the comfort of his presence. 48 hours, Maria said. "Give me 48 hours, and I'll have everything we need to take him down permanently." Those 48 hours stretched into an eternity for Sarah and Tom. Each minute felt like an hour, each hour like a day. They barely slept, barely ate, their minds consumed with thoughts of Emily's safety. Sarah kept Emily close, ensuring she was never out of her sight, and Max never left Emily's side. The protective dog seemed to sense that the danger was escalating, that the threat was becoming more immediate and real. As the clock ticked down, Sarah's anxiety grew. She felt the weight of the world on her shoulders, the pressure of a mother determined to shield her child from harm. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside, sent her heart racing. She was hyper-aware of her surroundings, scanning the neighborhood for any sign of danger, any indication that Jake was getting bolder. On the morning of the 48th hour, Maria called with news. "I got into the storage unit," she said, her voice tight with controlled fury. "Tom, Sarah, you need to prepare yourselves for what I'm about to tell you. What I found in there, it's worse than we thought." Sarah's heart sank as she listened to Maria describe the contents of the storage unit. It was filled with disturbing evidence, a collection of items that suggested a deeply troubling pattern. There were photographs of children, some taken in public places, others that hinted at a much darker reality. There were toys, clothing items, and even a few personal effects that seemed to belong to children who had gone missing. Each item painted a more horrifying picture of the man they were dealing with. Maria continued, her voice steady but filled with determination. "We have enough evidence now to bring this to the police. We can't let him slip through our fingers again. We need to act before he has a chance to disappear." The weight of the moment settled heavily on Sarah's chest. She felt a mixture of relief and dread. Relief that they finally had something tangible to present to the police, but dread knowing that Jake's capture was just the beginning. There was still the uncertainty of what might happen next. As they prepared to meet Maria at the police station, Sarah took a moment to gather herself. She looked at Emily, who was playing quietly with Max, blissfully unaware of the danger that had been lurking so close for so long. The sight of her daughter filled Sarah with a fierce sense of purpose. She would do whatever it took to protect her. With a deep breath, Sarah steeled herself for what lay ahead. She knew that confronting the reality of Jake's predatory nature would be difficult, that the journey to ensure Emily's safety was far from over. But she also knew that they were no longer alone in this fight. Maria was with them, and together they would do everything in their power to ensure that Jake would never threaten another child again. As they drove to the police station, Max sat in the back seat, his demeanor calm but alert. He was ready to protect his family, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Sarah reached back to give him a reassuring pat, grateful for his unwavering loyalty and instinct. They were a team, and together they would confront the darkness that threatened their world. The game had entered a new phase, and the stakes had never been higher. But Sarah was determined. With every fiber of her being, she would fight to keep her daughter safe, to bring Jake to justice, and to ensure that no other child would ever have to face the terror that Emily had narrowly escaped. The police station was a sterile, institutional building that smelled of stale coffee, industrial disinfectant, and the accumulated weight of countless human tragedies. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with a constant, slightly irritating buzz that seemed to permeate every corner of the building. Sarah walked through the heavy glass doors with Tom at her side, his hand firmly placed on the small of her back, a gesture of unwavering support. Maria led the way with the confidence of someone who had navigated these halls many times before. Her posture straight and authoritative, her expression focused and determined. The evidence Maria had gathered was contained in a series of carefully organized folders, each one labeled and color-coded for easy reference. A flash drive held digital copies of photographs, documents, and surveillance footage, all meticulously cataloged, dated, and presented in a way that left no room for doubt or ambiguity. Maria had done her work with the precision of someone who understood that the difference between justice and injustice often came down to the smallest details, the most careful documentation. Detective James Patterson was a veteran investigator with 15 years of experience in the Crimes Against Children unit. He was a man in his mid-50s, with salt and pepper hair, tired eyes that had witnessed humanity's darkest impulses, and a demeanor that was simultaneously compassionate and hardened. His office was sparse. A desk, a few filing cabinets, a photograph of his own children on the corner of his desk. When Maria laid out the evidence before him, his expression remained professionally neutral, but his eyes betrayed the gravity of what he was seeing. He leaned forward, his fingers carefully tracing the edge of one of the photographs, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "This is substantial," Patterson said, slowly, his voice measured and deliberate. "This is significantly more than we had before. The connections between the cases, the pattern of behavior. It's compelling. Where exactly did you obtain this evidence, Ms. Rodriguez?" Maria met his gaze steadily, unflinching. "That's not important right now, Detective. What's important is that you have what you need to bring him in for questioning. What's important is that you have enough to get a warrant for his residence and his storage unit. What's important is that you can stop him before he has another opportunity to harm a child." Patterson nodded slowly, understanding the implication without needing further explanation. Maria had likely obtained some of this evidence through questionable means, operating in the gray area that private investigators inhabited, a space that law enforcement couldn't access due to constitutional constraints and legal limitations. But he wasn't going to press the issue. In his 15 years of experience, he had learned that sometimes the most important evidence came from sources that existed outside the official system. As long as the evidence was solid and could be corroborated through legal channels, it would hold up in court. "I'll need to verify some of this," Patterson said, already reaching for his phone with a sense of purpose. "But based on what I'm seeing here, I believe we have sufficient probable cause to bring Jacob Mitchell in for questioning. We'll also apply for warrants to search his residence and the storage unit. This is good work, Ms. Rodriguez. This is very good work." Over the next several hours, the machinery of the justice system began to turn with deliberate precision. Detective Patterson and his team worked methodically through the night, verifying Maria's findings, cross-referencing the photographs with missing children databases and case files that stretched back nearly a decade. They contacted other jurisdictions, other police departments in states where Jake had previously resided. With each match, with each connection, the case against Jake grew stronger and more undeniable. The pattern became clearer, the evidence more compelling. Sarah, Tom, and Maria waited in a secure room at the police station, a small space with gray walls and a single window that looked out onto the parking lot. A television mounted in the corner showed a live feed from the surveillance cameras positioned outside Jake's rental house. Sarah's hands trembled as she watched, her fingers intertwined with Tom's, their palms pressed together in a gesture of mutual support and shared anxiety. By late afternoon, a team of officers was dispatched to Jake's rental house. Sarah held her breath as she watched them arrive, their vehicles pulling up to the curb with practiced efficiency. The officers emerged from their cars, badges visible, hands resting on their duty belts, their movements precise and controlled. They had done this before. They knew how to handle dangerous situations, how to approach a suspect with caution and professionalism. Sarah watched as they approached the door, one officer positioned to the side, another directly in front, a third covering the rear exit. The warrant was presented, and Sarah could see the moment Jake opened the door. Even through the grainy surveillance footage being transmitted to the police station, she could see the moment his expression changed. the moment he realized he'd been caught. His face went pale, the color draining from his features like water from a basin. For a moment, his predatory confidence, that cold, calculated demeanor that had characterized his behavior at the park, seemed to crack, revealing something raw and desperate beneath the surface. Jake attempted to close the door, but the officers were too quick, too experienced. They forced their way inside with practiced efficiency, and within moments, Jake was on the ground, his hands wrenched behind his back, the cold metal of handcuffs clicking around his wrists. Sarah heard the muffled sound of his rights being read to him by a stern-faced officer, the familiar words that she had heard countless times in television shows and movies, but which now carried a profound weight and significance. Sarah felt Tom's hand squeeze hers so tightly that it almost hurt. But she didn't pull away. The pressure was grounding, real, a physical manifestation of the emotional intensity of the moment. Tears streamed down her face as she watched Jake being led from the house, his head down, his shoulders hunched. The image of a man whose carefully constructed facade had finally crumbled. "It's happening," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's finally happening." Jake was transported to the police station and placed in an interrogation room, a small, windowless space with a metal table bolted to the floor, metal chairs on either side, and a mirror that was almost certainly one-way glass. Sarah and Tom were escorted to a viewing room, a space separated from the interrogation room by that one-way glass, where they could observe without being seen or heard. Detective Patterson entered the interrogation room with measured steps, a file of evidence tucked under his arm. He was accompanied by another detective, a younger woman named Sarah Chen, who specialized in behavioral analysis and had spent years studying the psychology of predatory behavior. They sat across from Jake, the file of evidence spread out on the metal table between them, like a prosecutor laying out a case. "Jacob Mitchell," Patterson began, his voice measured and professional, each word carefully enunciated. "Do you understand why you're here?" Jake's demeanor had shifted dramatically from the moment of his arrest. The predatory confidence that had characterized his behavior at the park, the calculated coldness that had allowed him to stalk Sarah and Emily, seemed to have evaporated. He was replaced by a man who was attempting to project an air of indifference, but whose hands trembled slightly as they rested on the table, whose jaw clenched and unclenched in a rhythmic pattern that suggested internal tension and stress. He didn't answer immediately, instead leaning back in his chair and studying the detective with an expression of calculated indifference. His eyes were cold, devoid of emotion, the eyes of a man who had spent years compartmentalizing his actions, separating his predatory behavior from his sense of self. "I want a lawyer," Jake said finally, his voice devoid of emotion, each word clipped and precise. Patterson nodded, unsurprised. He'd expected this. He'd conducted hundreds of interrogations over his career, and he knew that suspects with anything to hide would immediately invoke their right to legal representation. "That's your right. But before we end this conversation, I want you to look at something." Patterson slid a photograph across the table with deliberate slowness. It was one of the images from Jake's storage unit. A photograph of a young girl, no more than 5 years old, taken in what appeared to be a public park. The girl was sitting on a bench, eating an ice cream cone, her face visible in perfect clarity. The innocence captured in that moment was stark and heartbreaking, a moment that should have been carefree and joyful, but which was instead tainted by the predatory gaze of the man who had taken the photograph. The man who had stalked this child, the man who had documented her for purposes too dark to contemplate. "Do you recognize her?" Patterson asked, his voice steady and measured. Jake's jaw clenched, the muscles in his face tightening visibly. But he said nothing. His eyes flicked to the photograph and then away, as if unable to maintain contact with the image of his victim. Patterson slid another photograph across the table, then another and another. Each one showed a different child, each one evidence of Jake's predatory behavior spanning years. The photographs were taken in parks, shopping centers, playgrounds, neighborhoods. All places where children should feel safe, where parents should be able to let their children play without fear. Each photograph represented a child who had been targeted, stalked, documented by a predator who had spent years perfecting his craft. These children, Patterson said, his voice hardening with each word, have been reported missing over the past 8 years. Their families have spent years not knowing what happened to them, not knowing if their children were alive or dead, not knowing if there was any hope of ever seeing their loved ones again. The uncertainty, the not knowing, it's a kind of torture that never ends. And we have evidence that you were in the vicinity of each disappearance. We have surveillance footage placing you at or near the locations where these children were last seen. Jake's face remained impassive, a mask of calculated indifference. But his hands clenched into fists on the table, his knuckles turning white from the pressure. The tremor in his hands had become more pronounced, a physical manifestation of the stress and anxiety he was experiencing. "I'm not saying another word without my lawyer," he said, his voice cold and final, each word delivered with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment, who had prepared for the possibility of capture. Patterson gathered the photographs and the file, his expression grim but not defeated. He had what he needed. The evidence was overwhelming, the pattern undeniable. "That's fine. We have enough." As the interrogation ended and Jake was led back to his holding cell, Sarah felt a wave of emotion wash over her, a complex mixture of relief, anger, sadness, and a sense of cautious hope. It wasn't relief exactly, because there was still so much uncertainty ahead. There would be bail hearings, preliminary hearings, a trial that could take months or even years. There would be the possibility of appeals, of legal technicalities that could derail the prosecution. But it was a step. It was progress. It was justice beginning to move, however slowly and imperfectly, in the right direction. Tom pulled Sarah into his arms, and she buried her face in his chest, allowing herself to cry. Tears of relief, tears of anger, tears of the emotional release that comes from surviving a traumatic experience and seeing the perpetrator brought to justice. "He can't hurt her anymore," Tom whispered into her hair, his own voice thick with emotion. "He can't hurt Emily anymore." Over the following weeks and months, the case against Jake grew stronger with each passing day. Forensic analysis of the items found in his storage unit yielded DNA evidence linking him to several of the missing children. The photographs were analyzed and cross-referenced with missing children databases, creating a horrifying catalog of his victims. The pattern of his movements and his employment history were documented with meticulous care, creating an undeniable timeline of predatory behavior that spanned nearly a decade and multiple states. Investigators discovered that Jake had been using multiple aliases, renting storage units under false names, maintaining a network of hidden locations where he stored evidence of his crimes. The scope of his predatory behavior was far more extensive than anyone had initially realized. He hadn't just targeted children in the immediate area. He had systematically hunted across state lines, leaving a trail of missing children in his wake. The media picked up the story, and soon Jake's face was plastered across news channels and newspapers. The headlines screamed about a serial predator, about a man who had evaded justice for years by moving from town to town, staying one step ahead of law enforcement, leaving a trail of missing children and devastated families in his wake. News vans lined the streets outside the police station and outside Sarah's home. Reporters thrust microphones toward anyone who might have information or a connection to the case. Sarah found herself at the center of a media circus that was both overwhelming and exhausting. Reporters camped outside her house, seeking interviews, wanting to know details about the encounter at the park, wanting to know how she'd managed to protect her daughter, wanting to know what it felt like to come so close to tragedy and emerge on the other side. She gave a few carefully worded statements, always with Maria by her side, always with Tom's supportive presence, always focused on the message that parents needed to trust their instincts, that they needed to teach their children about body safety, that they needed to be vigilant and aware. But the constant attention was exhausting in ways that Sarah hadn't anticipated. Every time she left her house, she was photographed. Every trip to the grocery store became a public event. Every moment of her private life seemed to be fair game for media consumption. The weight of being the public face of a predator's capture was taking a toll on her mental health. She found herself struggling with anxiety, with intrusive thoughts, with the lingering trauma of knowing how close she had come to losing her daughter. It was Max who kept her grounded during those difficult months. The dog seemed to understand, on some instinctual level, that Sarah was struggling, that she was carrying a burden that was too heavy for one person to bear alone. He provided a constant, unwavering presence of comfort and support. He would lay his head on her lap when she was feeling overwhelmed, would press his nose against her hand when she was crying, would simply be there in the way that only a dog could be. Present, non-judgmental, offering the kind of unconditional love and support that no human could quite replicate. Emily, too, seemed to understand that her mother needed comfort. The 3-year-old would climb into Sarah's lap and wrap her small arms around her mother's neck, offering comfort in her own innocent way. The bond between mother and daughter had deepened through the trauma, had become something stronger and more profound than it had been before. One evening, as Sarah sat on the back porch watching Emily play in the yard with Max, she reflected on how much had changed in such a short period of time. A few months ago, she'd been a mother living in blissful ignorance, unaware of the danger that had been lurking so close to her family. She had gone about her daily life with the assumption that the world was fundamentally safe, that bad things happened to other people, not to her. Now, she was a woman who had stared into the face of evil and had fought back. She had protected her daughter. She had helped bring a predator to justice. She had discovered reserves of strength and courage that she hadn't known she possessed. The evening was warm and pleasant, the kind of summer evening that seemed to promise peace and safety. Emily threw a ball for Max to retrieve, her small voice squealing with delight as the dog bounded across the yard with the enthusiasm of a much younger dog, his golden coat gleaming in the fading sunlight. He caught the ball mid-bounce and raced back to Emily, who squealed even louder, her face flushed with joy and excitement. The sight was so ordinary, so beautifully normal, that it brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Tom came out and sat beside her on the porch swing, the wood creaking gently beneath their combined weight. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close, and they sat in companionable silence, watching their daughter play, watching their dog protect her, watching the sun sink lower on the horizon. "How are you holding up?" Tom asked gently, his voice soft and concerned. "I'm okay," Sarah replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Some days are harder than others. The trial is coming up, and I know I'm going to have to testify, and I'm not looking forward to that." But we're safe. Emily is safe. That's what matters. It is, Tom agreed, his arm tightening around her. And thanks to you, and Max, and Maria, other children will be safe too. Other families won't have to go through what we went through. Sarah nodded, watching as Emily threw the ball again, watching as Max retrieved it with the dedication of a dog who understood that his primary purpose was to protect and serve his child. The bond between them was unbreakable, forged in the crucible of danger and survival. I've been thinking about something, Sarah said slowly, the idea that had been forming in her mind over the past weeks, finally crystallizing into something concrete and actionable. I want to establish a foundation, something to help families of missing children, to support prevention and education, to help other parents protect their kids. I want to turn this experience into something positive, something that can help other people. Tom turned to look at her, a slight smile playing at his lips. He had expected nothing less from his wife. Her capacity for compassion and her drive to help others, even in the face of her own trauma, was one of the things he loved most about her. That's a wonderful idea. We could work with Maria. She has connections, resources, the kind of network that could make something like that really work. The Max Foundation, Sarah said, watching as the dog brought the ball back to Emily, his tail wagging with the joy of a dog who was doing exactly what he was meant to do. In honor of the dog who saved my daughter's life, in honor of all the children he helped protect, in honor of the families who are still searching for their missing children. Over the following months, as the trial date approached, Sarah and Tom began to lay the groundwork for the foundation. They met with Maria, who provided invaluable advice and connections. They consulted with lawyers to establish the nonprofit structure. They began to reach out to families of missing children, to law enforcement agencies, to child safety organizations. The response was overwhelming. So many people wanted to help, wanted to be part of something that could make a difference in the lives of vulnerable children. The trial itself was grueling. Sarah had to testify about the incident at the park, had to describe in detail the moment she saw Jake, the moment she realized he was a threat, the moment she understood that her daughter's life was in danger. She had to relive the trauma in front of a courtroom full of people, had to answer questions from Jake's defense attorney, had to maintain her composure while describing the most frightening moments of her life. But she did it. She stood up in that courtroom and told her story. She looked Jake in the eye and described what he had done, what he had tried to do, the danger he posed to children everywhere. And when she finished her testimony, there was a sense of closure, a sense that she had done everything in her power to ensure that Jake would face justice for his crimes. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning with a guilty verdict on multiple counts: attempted kidnapping, stalking, possession of child exploitation material, and several other serious charges. The judge sentenced Jake to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never have the opportunity to harm another child. As the gavel came down and the sentence was delivered, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. It wasn't complete closure. Closure was something that the families of the missing children would never truly experience. But it was justice. It was accountability. It was the knowledge that Jake would spend the rest of his life behind bars, unable to hunt, unable to stalk, unable to prey on the vulnerable. As the evening deepened and the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and deep purple, Sarah felt a sense of purpose crystallize within her. The battle against Jake wasn't over. There were appeals to consider, legal proceedings that would likely continue for years. But she was ready. She was ready to channel her trauma into something positive, ready to dedicate herself to helping other families, ready to spread awareness about child safety, ready to create a world where children could play safely in parks without fear. The Max Foundation was officially established 6 months after Jake's conviction. The Foundation's mission was to provide support and resources to families of missing children, to fund prevention and education programs, to work with law enforcement to improve investigative techniques, and to advocate for stronger child protection laws. Sarah served as the executive director, bringing her personal experience and her fierce determination to protect children to bear on the work. Max became the Foundation's unofficial mascot and ambassador. The Golden Retriever appeared in promotional materials, at fundraising events, at awareness campaigns. His story, the story of a dog who had saved a child's life through his protective instinct and unwavering loyalty, resonated with people across the country. Donations poured in, and the Foundation was able to expand its programs and reach far beyond what Sarah had initially imagined. Emily grew up knowing that she had a special protector, a dog who had loved her fiercely and unconditionally. She also grew up understanding, in age-appropriate ways, the importance of body safety, of trusting her instincts, of speaking up if something didn't feel right. Sarah made sure that her daughter understood that what had happened was not her fault, that she had done nothing wrong, that her mother had protected her because that was what mothers do. Years later, when Emily was a teenager, she would volunteer with the Max Foundation, helping to organize awareness campaigns and support groups for families of missing children. She understood, in a way that few people did, the importance of the work. She had lived through the fear, the uncertainty, the relief of knowing that the person who had threatened her safety was behind bars. And Max, even as he aged and his golden coat turned silver, remained a symbol of protection and love. He continued to accompany Sarah to Foundation events, his presence a reminder to everyone who saw him of the power of love, the strength of a protective instinct, and the unwavering loyalty of a dog who would stand between his child and danger, no matter what the cost. The confrontation with evil had changed Sarah forever. It had shown her the depths of human darkness, but it had also shown her the power of love, the strength of a mother's protective instinct, and the unwavering loyalty of a dog who would stand between his child and danger, no matter what. It had shown her that trauma could be transformed into purpose, that pain could be channeled into compassion, that one person's determination to protect their child could ripple outward and help protect countless other children. The journey was far from over, but Sarah was no longer afraid. She was ready to fight, ready to protect, ready to make a difference in the world.